afternoon, good evening, and good morning for everyone. I think should start because we had a very good presentation now that is very promising from Liz O'Donoghue. I don't know if I pronounce your name very well, but Liz and Tom Robinson will be presenting us this afternoon or this evening or this morning. And they, Elizabeth or Liz O'Donoghue, she is the Director of Sustainable Development Strategy for the Nature Conservancy in California chapter. She's focusing on innovative mitigation approaches, greenprints, and sustainable land patterns and transportation. Prior to joining the Nature Conservancy, Lee served as Strategic Planning Director and Public Affairs Director at Amtrak West. And before that, she was Special Projects Director and Legislative Assistant for Transportation and Natural Resource Policies for U.S. Senator Frank Lautenberg. And before that, a policy associate at a consulting firm in New Jersey focusing on transportation, environmental, and healthcare issues. She holds a BA from Oberlin College and a certificate with distinction in business administration from UC Berkeley Extension. Tom Robinson is a principal of Tom Robinson Consulting and he directs the Conservation Lands Network project for Together Bay Area and assists nonprofits and municipalities plan for landscape health and climate adaptation. Before that, the consulting, Tom was director of conservation science and innovation at Bay Area Open Space Council and conservation planner at Sonoma County, AG Plus Open Space. He holds a bachelor degree in ecology from University of California, San Diego, and a master's degree in GIS sciences from San Francisco State University. So please welcome our panelists for this session. And I hope we are going to have a very fruitful session.
Thank you, Paulo. That was a great introduction. Really, really wonderful to see everybody today. And I was going to say good afternoon, but now we know it's good evening, good morning, and all throughout the time zone. Okay, as Paulo mentioned, I'm Liz O'Donoghue with the Nature Conservancy, and together with Tom Robinson, we'll be presenting today on Greenprints, what they are, why and how they are created, and we'll do a very quick survey of Greenprints around the world. Before we start, I want to thank Christina Hill for inviting us to present to you today. The Nature Conservancy is an international conservation organization in 72 countries around the world and in every state in the United States. The mission of the Nature Conservancy is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends, and the vision is a world where the diversity of life thrives and people act to conserve nature for its own sake and its ability to fulfill our needs and enrich our lives. Now, I mention that because you can see the interconnection between nature and people, both in the mission and the vision statement, and Greenprints are designed to foster that connection. Tom, could you introduce yourself and the Together Bay Area?
Yeah, happy to. Thrilled to be here. Thanks everybody for being here, and we're excited to share what we know about greenprinting. I work for an organization called Together Bay Area. I'm a project director of, as Paulo said, the Conservation Lands Network, and that's a biodiversity focused conservation plan for the San Francisco Bay Area, and that is a project that's housed at Together Bay Area, and Together Bay Area is a regional nonprofit that focuses on the 10 counties that comprise the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a region of about 4.5 million acres or about 1.8 million hectares. And the Together Bay Area it is very focused on this one location, whereas the Nature Conservancy has this global mission. Our mission is somewhat focused on nature and people who live in the San Francisco Bay Area. And it's made up of a lot of member organizations, ranging from large park districts, water supply districts, land trusts and land conservation organizations, as well as nonprofits that seek to reverse some of the inequities that have existed in providing access to nature's values and benefits to all of our community. So it's a really neat nonprofit that's, again, very focused on the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
Mm-hmm.
So about Greenprints, what is a Greenprint? It's a strategic conservation plan or tool that reveals the environmental, economic, social, and human health benefits that parks, open space, and working lands provide to communities. It's not a new idea. There are over 60 completed in the United States and growing interest in areas beyond the United States around the world. We've captured the Greenprint showed here in the Greenprint Resource Hub, which is an online resource tool with the address below. We plan on updating the Resource Hub in the next year, so we would love to hear your feedback on what is helpful to you to help guide us in that work. So Greenprints are a flexible framework that can represent and span different landscapes, be it urban, rural, urbanizing, agricultural landscapes, and everything in between. And they can be at different scales. They can be for larger regions, millions of acres, and for smaller areas like a city or even a neighborhood of a city. While they can be very different, there are some commonalities. The main objective is to integrate nature into land use planning decisions and community investments. So that is kind of the primary goal of a Greenprint. While the users of a Greenprint are varied, can be from different sectors, including those that know nothing about conservation, like transportation and builders. Greenprints are designed around the user with the information, access, and format to make it easy for them to use. They're essentially designed to be used by somebody who does not have expertise in GIS or even a scientist. Moving on, Greenprints highlight the multiple benefits of natural and working lands, such as cleaner water, cleaner air, climate resilience and mitigation, and food production, and recognizes that an acre of land doesn't represent one of these benefits. It can contain many of these benefits. And they include spatial data geared to support the Greenprints goals and narrative. These are some questions for considering whether a Greenprint can help you achieve your conservation goals. Why would you do a Greenprint? What is the goal? Who are the users? What values and data will be in it? And what will it look like? And Tom and I will structure our presentation based on these questions. So first, why would you pursue a Greenprint? Maybe you're working in a region where nature was and is an afterthought. Sprawling development and land use patterns that continue to swallow up valuable farmland, habitat, water resources. And once they're gone, they're very hard to restore, if not impossible. Or maybe you're working in a nature poor area or access to nature is difficult, particularly in communities that have experienced environmental harm and lack of investment. It seems like every region is experiencing climate stress and it will get worse. Drought, fires, flooding, extreme heat. Maybe you see the opportunity to advance nature as a solution to mitigating climate stress. In all of these cases, a Greenprint can help. It could demonstrate that nature provides essential services for human health and well-being, economic vitality, and resilience. And it seeks to frame nature as an asset to a community or region, creating a dynamic where healthy people, abundant nature, and natural infrastructure can support community vitality. And by doing this, nature has a chance to deliver the benefits to communities if it's valued and if it's protected. So if nature is an asset, why is investing in nature so difficult? Most people view a region this way. Here's a map of the San Francisco Bay Area, a very typical map you might see. There are roads, cities, a few parks, mostly major regional or national parks, but a lot of white space. And so developers and planners and infrastructure agencies see that white space as nothing being there. And therefore it's the path of least resistance. However, there is color in that landscape. We see water resources, carbon storage, habitat and wildlife connectivity corridors, and many more. How do we bridge that difference of understanding? Our challenge, and kind of the fundamental reason for a Greenprint, is to bring these two maps together so that nature is part of the process from the start and planning can be more holistic. But it's difficult to do. There are many barriers to planning with natural resources. The data is often hard to access and use. Planning tools do not measure impacts or benefits to natural resources, so they're not prioritized. And we need support from communities to identify what information is meaningful and how it can help them in their lives. Greenprints are designed to overcome these barriers, enabling decision makers and stakeholders to view nature as an essential service. They can be a tool to help them invest in nature-based solutions. So continuing on the key questions, what is the goal of a Greenprint? It's important to really identify and understand that goal. And that's part of the process of establishing if you want to do a Greenprint. This will help frame the structure, identify the key users and the data. Here are some typical goals from different Greenprints. It can be designed to incentivize balanced growth in an urbanizing area, to protect and restore environmental services, to focus on human health and quality of life. Climate risk and resilience is becoming more and more a focus. It can also be used to guide investments of public or private dollars, and also create a common vision in an area that might be in conflict with the various stakeholders. It's critically important to identify the target users. You can consider what decisions or situations you want to influence, and then who you need to influence. It could be land use planners, transportation or water agencies, community-based organizations or funders. And then once you identify who your key users are, you ask representatives of those users to be advisors or partners in this effort. This is the user-centered design that we spoke about earlier. While the tool may be accessible to everyone, the tool needs to work for your key users. We've all seen and have developed tools that are really interesting and are really interesting to the people who create them and interesting to the people who may be interested in them. But if the people who you're designing it for cannot use it, it's really kind of, unfortunately, a waste of resources and effort. So the user-centered design is really important. I'll hand it off to Tom.
Great, thank you, Liz. So I'm going to talk about what further a little bit more about what goes into a Greenprint. But so no doubt you're getting the point that Greenprints are most successful when they are designed within a local context. So when answering what goes into a Greenprint, ultimately it should be nature's values and benefits specific to that locale. But generally we can step back and we can kind of think of the contents as combining elements of habitat, where species and ecosystem functions are still happening. Working lands, so farms and ranches, watershed lands for drinking water supplies, timber lands, basically where resources are being used, community where people live, and accessible lands and waters for peoples, where people can have sort of direct access to nature's values and benefits. But the trick in green printing is to map these elements accurately and try to incorporate the interplay between them. So it's one thing to map water yield, for instance, like how much water is sort of available to the system, to natural systems or community systems, human systems. But in green printing, you want to go an extra step and say, well, what does that mean for farmers? Or what does that mean for public drinking water supplies? Next slide, please. So Greenprint users, as Liz was mentioning, are multi-sector and therefore might not be experts at obtaining or using or interpreting environmental data sets like climate modeling and hydrologic models, for instance. So for example, a transportation planner might not be knowledgeable about the best biodiversity data or concepts or how to interpret those. And so our role as Greenprinters is to bridge the gap between data and the practitioners making those real world decisions on an everyday basis. So go the extra mile to make sure that the data are relevant. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide. And so one key example of that bridge function is communicating climate change. So for instance, it's all well and good to have reached into the bag of evolving science around the current state of climate change and its impacts, and to have access to those information. But as an example of going that extra step, for instance, in the Bay Area Greenprint, we don't display information about climate change without discussing them in terms of in terms that others can understand. So planners, that transportation planner in the previous example, they understand risk, and they also understand resilience. They understand how you make a system or a piece of infrastructure sort of resilient to the elements, for instance. So we use terms that are not esoteric, that they're not scientific, like risk and resilience, and we cast the climate change information in these two ways. So risk for in a Greenprint context might be, how are biodiversity, how are communities and resources threatened by climate change? And then the resilience part is how can nature-based solutions help communities and resources be more resilient to the effects of climate change? This is kind of an example of going the extra mile. Next slide. And so just continuing keeping us at a fairly high altitude when talking about Greenprints, and we'll go into the details in a little bit, but there's a lot of different ways that Greenprints look and function. For instance, this example from Connecticut here in the United States shows discrete priorities for three key resources: forestry, water supply, and agriculture. And you can see that, the farm parcels are in one color, and the forest parcels are in another, and the water parcels are in another. And this is a really great example of a Greenprint. This type of Greenprint is really great when your actions are very straightforward. On forestry parcels, we're going to do X. On water parcels, we're going to do Y. And on agriculture, we're going to do Z. This is a very small area geographically, and so it's very straightforward. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you have to zoom out and you're dealing with a larger area. And when you zoom out, you're going to incorporate more ecosystem services. So next slide. Here's an example of an area probably about 4 times the size of the previous example. This is an example here in California in the States, where this organization has taken multiple values, water, habitat, agriculture, recreation, and wildlife viewing, and they combined priorities for these to get kind of wall-to-wall priorities for multiple resources. And this is great for multi-agency objectives. So there's lots of agencies can see themselves in these different values, and they can understand sort of where these combined priorities exist. still another example, the example that Liz and I are really familiar with, next slide, is where you take the wall-to-wall priorities for the individual values and benefits, you place the prioritization scheme in the hands of the user. And so this is sort of the maximum utility to different agencies, includes, you know, nonprofits and advocacy organizations. Using sliders, you can change the look of the map depending on your priorities. If you care about all these things like multiple types of biodiversity, multiple water resources, agriculture, carbon, recreation, you can use these sliders to go up and down and see where there are hot spots of priority. So at the end of the day, you have a Greenprint should illustrate the fact that for these different values, not all areas are equal in their benefit to nature and people. Next slide, thank you. So the Greenprint, so that's kind of like, you know, there's multiple, you know, kind of core ways to approach Greenprints, but they ultimately find themselves like looking very differently as well. So this is, you know, in a couple of examples where the Greenprint takes a narrative, an educational narrative kind of tact, where maybe you use a story map to bring a community along on a journey, an educational journey about the values and benefits of nature in their area. And it's, again, it's an educational, it's a way to get people understanding what values exist in their area and to get them to care about it and advocate for, say, more urban trees like the one on the left. So that's one way, Greenprint. These are very, very successful models. Next slide. Or Greenprints can be very tool-based, enabling one to access or assess future actions related to human resource use, for instance, and quantify potential values and impacts. Now, this is definitely getting into that kind of toolbox realm. It's less about educating public to care about what's around them and much more about kind of nuts and bolts in kind of a planning realm. Next slide. And this is this kind of more nuts and bolts tool-based design is what the Bay Area Greenprint is designed using. And so I'm going to go a bit deeper on this tool that covers, as I mentioned, this kind of 1.8 hectare region in California. Next slide. So in the Bay Area Greenprint, embedded are 10 nature's values and benefits, water yield, so how much water is available, food production values, compensatory mitigation, which is fancy shorthand for species that are threatened or endangered, and society has decided that if you mess up their habitat, you're going to have to pay. So where do those exist? Carbon storage, air quality, habitat connectivity, water quality, outdoor recreation, prioritized habitat, and water hazard risk reduction. And before I talk about these overlays, I just want to mention that I'm sure wherever you are in the world, you look at these 10 different nature's values and benefits, and probably all of them are relevant to your area, maybe some more than others. But the key here was we dived into the full bag of nature's values and benefits and asked practitioners, local planners, whether they're transportation planners or land use planners, when you think about the environment, where are the hiccups for you? What do you need to know the most about? And if they say, well, we need to know about habitat, we pushed them a little further and then we said, well, what exactly do you need to know about habitat? And it comes out, they said, we need to know where the red tape is. We call it red tape, meaning where are we going to get into regulatory issues? And then also, where are those prioritized habitats where the biologists agree we should not be developing? And so it's kind of, we have this saying, in America, just the facts, ma'am. Just stick to the most important elements. And so instead of throwing, even though you're seeing a lot there, instead of throwing the whole the whole picture in each one of these categories, we're being very selective about the types of information and making sure it's tailored to their needs. And let me say just a quick something about the overlays here. It's all well and good to have these values. We did our level best to map these values that you see here on the left, but on the right, we understand that these values are not in silos, that things like public policy and climate change and urban greening and resilience, they are threads that go through all of these. And so we chose to treat them that way. And we'll explain what that looks like in just a second. Next slide. So information in the Bay Area Greenprint can be accessed in 5 different ways. We have a natural resource dashboard showing the different counties and sort of how they stack up against each other, looking at these different values. So you can say, show me carbon, where are the carbon rock stars in our area? You can kind of take a look at that sort of dashboard level. We have a web map and a data download tool, so you can hunt and peck and download. We have that slider where you can slide the relative values of the different ecosystem services and get that kind of hotspot map. We have methods and data so that you can get your questions answered around what are we actually using and what are the calculations we used. But most importantly is this reporting tool. And so I'm going to talk about that. This is really where the users get the most value. Not everybody is a GIS analyst and want to download all the data. And not everybody is interested in the step back whole, regional perspective. So next slide. So you're thinking about developing a Greenprint in your area. We encourage you to look at a couple of things. So assuming you have good data for your region, and we're using our food production value as an example here, but we have different, if we were talking about biodiversity, we'd have different elements and different values, metrics, but we're just using food production. So the first thing is we encourage you to kind of first allow a user to define their area of interest. It could be a trail, or it could be a subdivision project, or it could be a utility project, or even an entire county or a watershed. And so you define a user area. And the first question is how much of each one of these values exists in your area of interest? The second element, next slide, is everybody wants to know, is that a lot? It's all well and good to report how much of one of these values is, but in context, is that a lot? So if you find that you have, say, 26% of some value within your whole county, that is probably cause for most people to kind of sit up and take notice. The next question, next slide, is how well is the resource protected? We're talking, all of this is spatial, all of this is these are land-based values. And so we can overlay maps of conserved land and get a sense for how much of the area is already protected. Next slide. And here is where we're going the extra mile, I think, as I described earlier. We added these did you knows, and I think if you're doing your Greenprint, really look closely at these types of things. So we have this did you know, and we're translating these food production metrics into kind of a real world example. So we have here, and all of this is calculated on the fly based on their user area. Crops in this area are worth as much as $23 million. So if the crops in this area will be to be disturbed or to be removed, that's a significant economic impact. Next slide. So for each one of these, we want to ask, what about climate change? That's the key question we always get. And so we have our risk here is that warmer or drier climate may require additional irrigation. And the opportunity for resilience is that growers in this area are particularly innovative. And in this area that the person chose, we say 87% of agricultural land in this area was not fallowed in recent years despite drought conditions. So there's sort of hope for this area in terms of climate change. Next slide. And then, of course, we want to ask, are there any policies that protect food production in this area? And so we're unearthing all of that information and making it readily available for folks. Really, really important. Next slide. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about advancing nature-based climate solutions. Greenprints are an excellent way to embed climate adaptation and mitigation into the public domain and public decision making. So one is carbon sequestration and storage. The other is showing the co-benefits of natural and working lands conservation and how those help elevate natural climate solutions, and also highlighting specific nature-based solutions that make communities and ecosystems more resilient to climate risk. So next slide, I'll dive into these. So one way, of course, is just to report how much carbon storage is in your area. And so you can choose the different pools of carbon. We have above ground live carbon, we have soil carbon, and then we also have maps of urban forest carbon storage. And again, we want to make these numbers relevant to really anybody. And so we have this did you know, and we cast all of this carbon in terms of passenger vehicles driven for 1 year and also trees. So all of this again is calculated on the fly. Next slide. And then in terms of advancing natural climate solutions, so we've got our carbon storage. And so maybe you're interested in the carbon storage, but then we add air quality, habitat connectivity, water quality, outdoor recreation, and water hazard. And that gives you a much more full picture of the full solution set. So, you know, come for carbon storage, but stay for all these other benefits. Next slide. And then finally, Greenprints are excellent at going straight to the heart of the matter and talking about climate risks. So sea level rise, how much of the area in your area of interest is expected to be impacted by sea level rise? How about floods or fire risk or heat islands? All of that information can be embedded into Greenprints. And as planners are learning about, say, the biodiversity values in their area or the carbon storage area, they are also exposed to climate risks and are then sort of tasked with measures that would improve community resilience. Next slide. So just a couple more pieces from me. Stepping back from everything I just shared, if you're thinking about starting a Greenprint in your area, there's a couple of key questions to ask your stakeholders right at the outset. You want to make sure that that your information is relevant to specific problems in your area. You need to identify kind of what's the scope of the reliance on that ecosystem service. And I can tell you from where I live in California, and in Northern California, and in wine country of California, in Sonoma and Napa, water and fire risk are huge. Those are the big ecosystem services that we need to identify. Because we need to understand it's not just people relying on drinking water, but it's a lot of farmers contributing or needing water for growing grapes. So number of people, the beneficiaries, what are the importance, like what's the economic importance of the people relying on those ecosystem services? Where are the critical places that provide those ecosystem services, and what are the threats to those ecosystem services? So this is just a shorthand list that we feel if any of these pieces are left out, then your picture of the ecosystem service is perhaps not complete. So you want to really have good answers for each one of these questions. Next slide. And then just be aware of scale. The different ecosystem services have different spatial scales. And not only do they have spatial scales in the real world, for instance, water quantity, for instance, has spatial scales of hundreds of square kilometers in terms of catchments, whereas physical health benefits have a much smaller scale in terms of what's required for people to access nature or trails to add to their or maintain their health. So be aware of the actual spatial scale of these different ecosystem services, and then the scale of the data that you're using to match them. And you want to make sure that those match as well as possible. So maybe something to refer to later. This slide's kind of in the weeds a little bit. But now I'm going to hand it over to Liz to talk about just a few best practices in developing Greenprints.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm just going to go through this slide of best practices, and Greenprints are really evolving, and they will continue to evolve. So just a little bit of a snapshot is that the process, it's really important to engage diverse stakeholders that represent the area that you're investigating and developing the Greenprint for, and to really understand the breadth and the depth of their interests and their issues. Using accessible language and presentations, I think we all are in our world, and so we have to challenge ourselves to speak plainly. Define leadership roles early. There will be conflicts, and working through the decision-making process is really important, and it's very difficult. And be really transparent in the methods. One of the things we heard when Tom and I were working on the Bay Area Greenprint from users like transportation agencies and developers and others, they said, I don't know this data. You guys are the expert, but I want to be able to access it and have it fully transparent and know that everybody agrees. So transparency was really kind of rule number one. They don't want the black box of data. With the spatial analysis, there's always a lot of existing plans and efforts, and so you want to be a value add. You don't want to supersede, and you want to incorporate it and use the lessons learned from that. And then the regional context is really important. Even if you're looking at a neighborhood scale in a city, you really want to look at the regional context to see how the issues and the data can step back and tell maybe a larger story, maybe change the story that you're investigating. And as I mentioned, for implementation, you really need to design a Greenprint to support the decisions that key stakeholders will take. And Tom and others were very instrumental in sitting down with representative users and saying, how could you use this? And what is a barrier in your work that a Greenprint could help? And we designed the Greenprint around that. So we're at the last part of the session. I'm just going to go a very short survey of Greenprints around the world, some that have been developed and some that are developing. And these are from colleagues in the Nature Conservancy. So the first one we mentioned, an eco-urban assessment. This was a very early one in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And the area of focus was flood risk, air quality, and park access and connectivity. And they've used that to invest in nature-based solutions in that city that has a fairly large number of disadvantaged and communities of concern. One that is currently being developed is in Berlin. This is being done with the Nature Conservancy in partnership with the municipal government there. And the key focus are conservation actions to create new green space and restore existing green space, and to also look at climate change and climate risk. Pajaro Compass is one that's been done in California, and this was an example of a largely agricultural region that was always in conflict with the water users, the farmers, the ranchers, the conservation organizations. So the Pajaro Compass was really a community-driven conservation goal that is now being used and has created a network for people to work on issues and solutions together. The Chicago Greenprint we referenced earlier today, it's focused on equitable use of natural infrastructure for climate adaptation. So they looked at flooding, heat, air quality, and economic opportunity, and have created a number of maps to look at areas of greatest vulnerability and greatest opportunities. There's one being scoped right now in Chennai, India, and that is looking at the rapid urbanization and loss of wetlands and also drought. And so they're looking at, they're working with the municipal governments and partners to consider integrating nature and urban planning at the core. In Southern California, the Nature Conservancy is working with the Southern California Association of Governments. It's a region that is incredibly vast. It's about 25.5 million acres, 19 million people. And we're looking at the key users on the left, and themes currently are agriculture, conservation, community, built environment, risks and resilience in water, and equity and climate change are being woven throughout. So that will probably form the largest Greenprint when that is completed later this year. While we've looked at urbanizing environments, there's also opportunities for Greenprints in agricultural and natural communities. And that is really looking at a watershed to help inventory and prioritize conservation work to really bring those the charge for conservation with a broad base of stakeholders to the fore. And I think this is the final one, but there was a Greenprint that was developed in a district in Shanghai, and this is looking at fast urbanizing metropolis and how to preserve a core buffer core area for wildlife health. And so the Nature Conservancy and partners have been working with municipal government to bring forward the national government's goals for a national ecosystem approach into a very fast urbanizing environment of Shanghai. This has been extremely difficult because the expert knowledge is not easily accessible. And so we've been working closely with partners and the municipality to develop this Greenprint. So this is the final slide, just to get you thinking. What type of Greenprint would support your goal? What functionality is needed to support the intended users in making key decisions? And how will information be most effectively communicated? Those are kind of 3 key questions. And with that, we can pause for questions and comments. And I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to present. So I'm going to just give you the final slide, and I'll stop sharing so we can see each other.
Thank you very much, Liz and Tom. We have already 3 minutes for questions. So please, we have one observation here from Brian, who have said that he has some questions for you. He says, your illustrations of Greenprint tools allow people to prioritize use values. The ability to address those is dependent on the land resources available and their uses. How are the suitability of land for particular uses, the political of public acceptability, or the adaptability of land present to users? And he asks, final, are they embedded in the Greenprint tools to guide priorities, or are they applied as post hoc analysis to evaluate, express the priorities? Do you have any comments on this, Liz or Tom?
Tom, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, just a great question. So we did our best to, so this question gets at the idea of combining data and sort of baking those data to where you have priorities or for suitability. And what we tried to do was use empirical data in very kind of no regret strategies of combining empirical data to get a sense for suitability for each one of the nature's values and benefits. And then we left it up to users, again, to use those sliders to find priority areas.
And I think you're also getting at the social aspect, which was the political or public acceptability. And one of the ways that we have tried to avoid any opposition to Greenprints is to not say what something should be done in the Bay Area Greenprint, but to just surface the information and people can make decisions on their own.
Thank you. Just one final remark. How do you feel the contribution that Greenprint can bring to Geodesign?
How can the contributions of a Greenprint be brought to?
For the framework of Geodesign, in a few words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tom, do you want to pick that one up? Framework for Geodesign? I mean, I'll say that really what a Greenprint is it's not a particular way to do something with a particular outline of what should be done. It's really about how to bridge the information and the spatial data and to communicate it in a way that matters to people in an interactive function. So what we're trying to show here, and the reason why we went through a quick survey, is that everyone looks different, but geodesign is often at the heart of it. But you have to really look at it from a human perspective and a user perspective and make it really easy for people to access and use nature-based information in a way that supports their goals.
I would just add, I think that's spot on, Liz. I would just add that Greenprints enable practitioners who don't think of themselves as geodesigners to be geodesigners eventually. It's one step to empower them to be doing that, because if you are a land use planner, you are essentially very close to being a geodesigner yourself. And so Greenprints help move them a little closer to that ideal.
Thank you. I think you have time for one more question. Don Fish said that do you think Greenprints looking at regions over time to see what has happened as a result in a process?
That's very difficult.
Do you Greenprints looking for?
Yeah, I think the question is, have you seen the impact of Greenprints over time on the landscape?
Yes, sure.
I think it depends what the Greenprints look like. In some cases, like the Bay Area Greenprint, we don't capture any of those stories. We're trying to do that now because we have no barrier to entry. Nobody signs up to use it, so we don't actually know. But what we've decided to do is we've worked to bake the Greenprint into different processes. So the Metropolitan Transportation Commission is using it in their transportation analysis, and they're using it in their priority conservation areas. So we'll see over time how successful it may be. I think, Carl, you had one question?
I did have a question. If you believe that the solution to the problem is substantially larger in geography than the local view of the problem, my question is, what are the really large areas globally, which might be multinational, that the Nature Conservancy is really interested in conserving? And then the second part of that is, would you approach that with a Greenprint?
That's a really good question. So I think there's a tension here between scale, data, and effectiveness, right? So we can look at really, if we think about land use change and that being one stressor, and you look at areas in the globe that are rapidly changing. If you look at communities in China, for example, these extremely big cities growing into mega cities, growing into mega regions. Is that a good target? And that might be a good target. So the Southern California area is incredibly large, but it's not multinational. I think the key is what data could support the work that you're trying to do. And right? And we found that,
We have global data at an incredibly detailed level right now.
uh-huh,
It's not a data problem. It's a question
Okay.
of the relationship between the analysis, the people, and the size of the geography.
right, and
The
so,
more you're looking at a big area, the less you're with the people that you need for your local work.
right,
But does the method then scale up when you've got 1 billion people in your study area rather than 20,000?
I would rather have the people who live on, folks who live in areas that have a local green print exposed to the idea of green printing when there is a larger initiative like we now have in the United States, with 30% of land and water conserved by 2030. If folks are understand green printing locally, aha, I get that. I get the larger picture now. That would be better.
Interesting. Okay. All right.
Thank you, everyone.